Good day all. Welcome to this VeriSM webinar hosted by the IFDC. Today I'm with Suzanne van Hove, Simon Kent, Johann Botha and Sigrid Janssen. My name is Simone van Zuilen and I will be your host. The webinar today will be about the VeriSM, the magical management mesh. The VeriSM model will be explained. Suzanne van Hove will be leading this session. She will provide understanding on how to do this. Note you're all on mute. You can ask questions using the chat function throughout the webinar. Throughout the webinar, there will be several sessions where questions will be answered. The webinar will be recorded. You will receive the recording of the webinar later this week. Enjoy the webinar. The floor is yours, Suzanne.
Thanks, Simone. I really appreciate it. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all of the participants. Very happy that you're here. Again, my name is Suzanne van Hove, and I will be the main facilitator today, but I am very fortunate to be joined by two wonderful colleagues, Johann Botha from South Africa, and another lead author of the Unwrapped and Applied volume, and also Simon Kent from the United Kingdom, who was a contributing author in both volumes of the VeriSM body of knowledge. So these two gentlemen will be joining throughout the presentation. So let's just go ahead and get started here by showing you what we're going to be discussing today. So this webinar is about the management mesh. There's been a lot of questions throughout the globe about the management mesh. So what we're going to do is introduce the mesh, give you a little bit of basics so that we are all level set and working from the same starting point, and then apply the mesh to a couple of different examples. One, a very generic example, and then one that's been using the case study that is included in the VeriSM Unwrapped and Applied volume. The last part of this presentation will be talking about how to support the mesh, and we have several organizations who have started to address or are addressing VeriSM. Simon Kent will be talking from Celeritas, and ServiceNow and For Me will be in the next presentation or the next webinar on the 18th and 19th of September. So let's just jump right in here, and everyone who has been following VeriSM, this model should be very familiar. We know that VeriSM is consumer oriented, and it is based on enterprise governance, the service management principles, and then the mesh. We have the four activities within this model of define, produce, provide, and respond. And again, this model rotates and revolves around consumer need. But before we can get into the mesh, we really have to understand some of the boundaries. So I'm going to pass over the speaking points for right now to Johann and have him walk us through some of the key elements within governance and the service management principles. Johann?
Hi, everyone. First off, I wasn't able to join in the previous session with audio, so I just want to express my thanks to Suzanne and to Claire, who's given me the opportunity to work with them to write the book, and to everybody at IFDC who had confidence in me to help with this sterling effort. We had an awesome team of supporting authors from all over the world. To each and every one of you, thank you for your contribution. I've learned a lot from you. So before we can start talking about doing things, we need to know where we're going. And governance and service management principles, together with something that we talk about in the first part of the new book, namely the organizational portfolio, really sets the scene for organizations to be able to use the mesh effectively. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that today. I'm just going to give you a quick teaser, because in one of the next sessions, we'll cover that part of the book a little bit in more detail. If you can carry on, Suzanne, click. Okay, so most of you have most probably seen this model before, the EDM model. You know, when we talk about governance, people tend to think about control, but actually the purpose of governance is to help the organization to move in a concerted and well-planned fashion in a specific direction That's determined by the governing body, but most probably very strongly influenced by all stakeholders. And you can see at the bottom of the picture, we said that in the mesh, there's basically two types of activities that happens. We need to do things to change the environment, and then we need to make sure that if we introduce new things into the environment, that we can properly support it and provide good services and products. So yeah, the governance model is really about knowing and understanding our context, based on that giving direction to the rest of the organization, and then making sure that the organization properly responds to that direction given. If you can go on, Suzanne. So from that governance effort comes goals and objectives. Another way that we give direction to the company is by defining policies. And then very importantly is also principles, because principles sort of encompasses not only what we need to do or what needs to get done, but also says who we are and how we view the world and how we view our relationship with other stakeholders within the organization. If you can go on to the next slide. Suzanne, click. Thank you. In the last few weeks, we've had a lot of questions around principles. Now, just as policies and goals and objectives cascade through the organization, so too do principles. So in the first book, we actually introduced a number of service management principles, and they were at different levels. So people were questioning why we had disparate principles. But I think what's important to know and understand is that, you know, we do define principles at an organizational level, but then we will define principles or refine that maybe rather at a divisional level and even a team level, and sometimes at an individual level. Similarly, when we define direction for the organization, it's the job of management to translate that into goals and objectives for a department, for a team. So goals and objectives also cascade. This is not a new idea. It's a very old idea, already defined in the 50s in Lean and in a principle called Hoshin-Kanri. If you can click again for me, Suzanne, thank you. So those are the things that set the scene, but at the end of the day, the organization, and that's why we wrote VeriSM, need to understand what they're going to do to be able to take their organization into the digital age. And there's basically three types of responses that we can have in our organization. The one is most probably not that new. That's the operational focus. This is something that IT departments generally are pretty good at because we've been doing it for a very long time. We've taken business processes and we've automated them to help the organization to be more effective and efficient. In VeriSM, we call this digital optimization rather than digital transformation, because transformation is really, it needs to be a more fundamental shift towards doing things differently. In the transformational space, there's two options available. Most probably the customer-focused view of the world is also not that new, because if you're into Lean or Agile, you know that focusing on the customer and making sure that you deliver value for the customer is an important thing. And then lately we've heard about a bunch of organizations that's doing something that basically just turns the world on its head. And that's the future-focused view of digital transformation. That's where people start being disruptive in marketplaces. Now, what we attempted to do in VeriSM is to give you some guidance around how to do any of these. If you can click again for me, Suzanne. So in the book, we've actually given you an idea of how you can respond if you need to improve your customer focus, or if you are busy focusing on efficiency within the organization. So that's operational, or if you're really thinking about, changing the way that your organization see the world and the market outside there. If you can click again for me, Suzanne. So what we've done is we've actually spent a lot of time to think about all of the different options that a governing body and the management of an organization can think about their approach to providing services and products, how that would be different in a digital age, and also mapping these different tools and techniques to give you, as the reader or user of VeriSM, an idea which tools and techniques most probably will work better within a specific context. If you can click again, Suzanne, you'll see that there's an absolute ton of ideas that we've got in the book, and in the next session or webinar, we'll do a little bit of a deeper dive into the options available for you in your organization to see how you're going to respond to these changes in the marketplace and this new world that we have to live in. So that's my, oh no, there's another one. If you can click again, Suzanne, all of these things will be represented then in the way that we think about our organization, how we deliver value to customers, and that is defined in what we call an organizational portfolio. The central theme within the organizational portfolio is organizational value streams. And the emphasis is on value streams, because remember, VeriSM is end-to-end, it's whole organization, it's everybody that's involved, and how that value streams will then leverage resources and capabilities and products and services, and the portfolio, the organizational portfolio, together with the direction given by the governing body in the form of goals and objectives and policies, and also the who we are, the principles that we've defined, really is the essential elements that's necessary for you to go and determine what your organizational mesh should look like. And that's my bit of the story. Until next time.
Thank you, Johann. So let's just do a quick little recap here before we go into the mesh. Remember that our model is definitely based and functional on our enterprise governance, the service management principles, and of course, always guided by the consumer. Enterprise governance and the service management principles provide the boundaries that we need. It provides the objectives and the conditions of how we're going to operate, and those ideas or those concepts will translate into the management mesh. So then what exactly is the mesh? Perhaps the best way to define the mesh is to detail what it isn't. And I think this is an important slide for people to understand how this mesh fits in. First of all, it is not IT only. It includes the strategies, the legal ramifications, the organizational competition, the management methods from across the organization. So it does not just focus on IT. It is not a CMDB on steroids. It is, those items are already found in ITIL, or in CMMI for services, or in COBIT, or in ISO 20000, though with the new version of 20000, there's a couple of changes in there. But the point is that VeriSM was never developed to duplicate efforts. So what this mesh is actually doing is expanding on and looking at service management from an enterprise view. Another thing that it is not an architecture or a network diagram. That's very much technologically oriented. We want an enterprise view and an application of service management across the enterprise. We want to know how the entire organization is primed and capable of supporting the product and service delivery that will meet the organizational mission, vision, goals, and objectives. And lastly, what it's not, it is not a definitive detailed record of organizational resources and capabilities, as well as the ways of working. This is a point-in-time picture. What the mesh will be is a point-in-time picture that will flex and update as changes occur within the organization. It will develop and mature as services are used, improved, and retired. So then if we know what it isn't, well, then what is the mesh really? And those of you who are consultants out there, you know that this is the #1 consultant answer to any question that anybody would ask, and that is, of course, it depends. The mesh is going to depend on the needs of the organization, the needs of the consumer, the requirements, the service management principles. It's really going to cover all of the possibilities that are there. So in reality, that mesh is a high-level representation of the elements that support service management from an enterprise perspective. It's a visual tool. It's based on enterprise governance. The service management principles will define the boundaries and the scope. There was a phrase that Claire had brought up in one of our discussions that I just thought it was brilliant. So Claire, I'm giving you points here. The mesh is there to stimulate conversation, and I think that is just a brilliant way of saying this is what the mesh does. It's going to stimulate a conversation, but to get that conversation to move away from that IT-only focus of that product and service. It allows us to explore and manipulate the capabilities and resources of that organization. So that's what it is. And again, you're probably saying, well, gee whiz, that doesn't tell me an awful lot. But so let's go ahead and dive into that mesh and say, well, how do we go about and build one? So first of all, you're seeing on the screen now the generic representation of the mesh. And please understand what we've created here. This is from the first book with a couple of different additions to some of the elements that are on the edges. But what we've built here is a representation, but the elements that we've added, these are possibilities. And we've taken information from, our global support group within all of the supporting authors that we've had through our own experiences. And these are elements that that we feel have global relevance to any organization that are supporting and delivering products and services. These are things to consider. This is not a list of requirements. So when we look at this mesh, you'll see very quickly that each edge has an other line, I guess we could say, or an other edge of the mesh where we can put in something that's different. Remember, we want to create this mesh that will support the delivery of products and services for your specific organization. So you may not need to have all of these elements. So, okay, so there's your basic into what that mesh is. So let's go ahead and say, well, how do I read the mesh? How do I use it? Well, first of all, we want you to use it in a counterclockwise fashion. Start with resources. What are those hard physical things that you have in your environment that you can utilize to produce a product or service, produce and support? Then move over to the environment. We're looking at the environment. We're going across the organization, internally and externally. Move down into the management practices then and say, what are we currently using? Again, looking across the entire organization. This has been one of the questions that have come up from the original book, the first book, and probably will continue to come up and saying, well, gee whiz, these are way too technically oriented. Where's the other management practices? Well, I'm here to tell you we got you covered. We have created that information for you, and we'll come to it later on in the presentation, but we've specifically left these management practices because we're talking about digital transformation. When you're talking digital transformation, the first half of that is digital, which means somehow the IT capability will be involved and supporting the delivery and improvement of any product and service. We've left those there, but again, we have that ubiquitous others that we can put in. And we've discussed this in the Unwrapped and Applied, and we'll discuss it later on in this presentation. The last edge is emerging technologies. And of course, this is probably going to be the most dynamic edge of all of them, considering how quickly technologies change. Please understand, again, that this is not a requirements list, all right? One area that we do want to focus on is this area of the service stabilizers. To me, this is a really important area because it is defining the processes, the measurements, and the tools that are currently being used within the organization to support the product and service delivery. These are the specific processes, tools, and measures that are needed to support any product or service. So you think about tools, think about an integrated service management tool set, or another tool that will be used for metrics or reporting capabilities. Those types of tools is what we're talking about. Measurements, what you've agreed with your consumer in terms of how are you going to report on the delivery and support of the products and services that your organization provides. And of course, the processes, what processes are in place that allow you to design, build, test, deploy, and support those products and services. So we want you to, again, understand, and I know this is probably the third or fourth time that I've said this, but this diagram is not comprehensive, it is not exhaustive, and it certainly is not a list of requirements. It's a, remember what we said the mesh was. It was a visual tool to stimulate a conversation. You can build this mesh to meet your needs. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a mesh then. Again, following the rules that we set up here, first one is that we want to look at resources. So first of all, where will we get that resource information? There's several sources listed for you on the slide. You know, thinking about going into the organization itself and talking to facilities or finance, looking at your product and service catalogs, discussing things with your steering committee, going into the PMO, into IT, that we can find this information, and we can find this information through a series of questions that we can ask. You may be asking, you know, what skills are available? What's being developed? One of my favorite questions is, you know, is the budget being based on the run, grow, transform model that we've seen so much? So how are we investing in our product and service delivery? So it's a very strategic question being answered in something very physical within these resources. We look at suppliers and saying, can we exploit current suppliers and get new products or services from them to support our own product and service delivery? What we want to do here is that we do not want to duplicate information. We don't want to duplicate our efforts. We've already talked about the mesh as not being a CMDB, but we want to have some sort of an idea of what we do have. So how do we represent it in the mesh? Well, what we've done is we've chosen to use lines. It is a mesh, so let's just pluck at the threads and say, this is what we have, this is what we are looking for as we go through the various views here. So these lines have created so many questions. We chose these lines because they can represent anything. Remember my it depends answer to the question of the mesh. They can represent quantity. They could represent maturity or magnitude or volume or anything else that needs to be represented. Of course, the important part, though, is when you decide to lay out a line or to lay out some representation of what is in your organization, document the unit of measure so that you understand what it is and how you've created that line or that measure. In this diagram here, we've got some fairly robust lines. You know, we can look at the magnitude of them. You know, areas of knowledge, the budget, suppliers, people, they all seem fairly big. Assets, well, there you go. We might have a limited number of stock, something along that line, but you would document how you're interpreting, okay? Remember that this mesh is there to generate a discussion and visually represent the resources and capabilities of that organization. So we'll talk more about these lines in a few slides down the road. So let's go ahead and look at the environment. So moving around counterclockwise, the environment is the next area that we want to assess. And the purpose of this assessment is really to understand the entire organization, where and how it operates. So we want to look internally and externally. We want to understand the culture, its competition, the legal or regulatory conditions and requirements. What do we have in place right now? So those processes, measures, and tools. So what we're looking here is to ask some questions around, what are some of these requirements that we have from a legal, regulatory, or statutory requirement? One of my favorite questions to ask is around the culture of the organization itself. I remember when I was studying in V2 of ITIL, where we always said we had to have a cultural operation going on and understanding that cultural assessment, and every process had that phase to it. It never really made sense to me until later on into my career. And this is the thing that makes the link. How many times have you ever wondered why the great ideas and the great services that you've produced or presented, why they weren't successful, why they weren't as successful as they should have been? And then I would want to say, have you ever explored the organizational culture itself? Think about an organization that their culture is very stable, very status quo, and meaning, they are very set in how they can work and operate. But think about that organization now in the age of digital transformation, where the requirements are for change and innovation and extreme and quick outcomes. So having that necessary velocity, that's going to be a big disconnect for the culture of the organization. So in the book, we spent some time discussing several tools that can provide this information in order to create a successful environment for change and for that digitally transforming organization. We've looked at creating a cultural profile. You'll see some information in the book around Chapman and Jen, where they list 7 dimensions of a culture in an organization, talking about innovation or outcome-oriented, stability, people or team-oriented, detail-oriented, and also aggressive, if your organization is an aggressive mover in your market space. If all of a sudden in the back of your mind you're saying, wow, that sounds like a SWOT analysis or a pest or pestle analysis, you're not wrong. But the question is do you actively review and understand the organizational culture as you go out and produce new products and services? Within the service stabilizers, as you generate the information, you really want to assess, are the processes accurate? Are they lean enough? Are they stable? Are they mature? What about the measurements and reports? Are there too many, too few? Most of you probably have too many. Are they used? Are they just thrown in the bin? What about tools? How are your tools functioning and working together? Are they disparate? Do you have duplication? Do you have too many? So these are all kinds of things that you could generate and create a representation of your mesh. So what I've done now is shown you the lines of this fictional organization, which I'll give you some context in a minute. And so we can look at these lines. For example, I'll just highlight a few things here or get some sort of on organizational culture. We're seeing that we have some sort of measure here. Maybe we're looking at some levels of maturity or immaturity, or that we don't really know. But look at the competition line. This organization seems to have quite a bit of competition for their products and services, that they have a good use of partners within their organization. So they're partnering with other organizations to create their product and service line. And then looking at the service stabilizers, very long line around the processes. It may mean that there are a lot of processes. It may mean that they're mature. It may mean that they're immature. You have to document and say exactly what it is. You have to define that unit of measure. And then, of course, we have multiple measurements and then maybe the same amount in tools. So again, that documentation of what it is that you're looking at is going to be very important. So let's go ahead and move on into the management practices. All right, so within the management practices, I have to say a couple of things first. And one of those is why is a management practice chosen? I think we have to start from the beginning. These management practices, or whatever management practices used, are typically chosen for 3 reasons. Changing expectations of employees. We change the management practice. Technological change. We will change the management practice due to technology, speed, velocity. And we also might change our management practice due to the emergence of new competitors. All of them will have an influence in the way that organization works, and we have to take those into account. So be prepared to move beyond a single focus of one management practice, and be prepared to be able to merge management practices for the benefit of your organization. Okay, to find this out, then to find this information, well, look for the in-place practices. You're going to have to go out and talk to people, understand or seek out, how the leadership is structured and what the styles that they provide or how they operate. Sources of information: HR, legal, quality control, audit, the auditing department if you have an auditing department. I think another good place to look about management practices is look at the commercial contracts. Contracts may require certifications or specific operating practices. So let's look at the lines that we have here. Well, we have this organization is, I'm just going to say it's an idle group, that they use Siam principles, that they have that management practice in place. And they also have a few others that we've just stuck under the other side. And I've done that specifically to kind of do a little bit of a promotion in what we've done in Unwrapped and Applied. So our resources for information around these management practices. First of all, in the first book, VeriSM, A Service Management Approach for the Digital Age, Table 25. And I think every time I talk about VeriSM, I'm constantly bringing up Table 25. So hopefully you're sitting out there and reaching for that first volume and quickly flipping to Table 25. I think it's brilliant. It defines so many different scenarios, and then it matches those scenarios to the various progressive practices that we focused on in the first book. Randy Steinberg did a great job with defining those progressive practices and creating that table. Each of those progressive practices, most of them are listed in the mesh diagram here. We're talking Agile, Lean, DevOps, Siam, Shift Left, the continuous delivery, and then customer and user experience. They were all defined as to what it is, what are its key concepts, the benefits and challenges of each of those practices, how to select the practice, when would be an effective use of the practice, or even a less effective use of that practice, and then also its relationship to service management overall. So we had a bit of a technical focus in that first book, and fair enough, we're talking about digital transformation. We have so many of those management practices out there where the community at large is demanding products and services at a faster and faster rate. Well, how do we do that? But let me move on into the next book of Unwrapped and Applied, Appendix D. In the next book, we've added more than 30 enterprise-wide management practices and models with a quick description and where to apply them. But throughout the book, there are numerous other models that are being described that are at that enterprise level, especially on how to develop and refine your governance, something that Johann has just quickly spoken about, and more information will be provided in the next webinar. Going back to Appendix D and some of the other models, please understand that the second book is not to teach you all of these models, but it is to give you enough information to say, wow, that seems to be a model that either we use, we should explore, or exploit. And it gives you enough information to then go and check out that model or seek additional help from an external party, or just within your own organization. Most of these models are probably being used today in your organization at one time or another. All right, so there's the management practices piece. Let's go ahead and move on to the emerging technologies. So we're on the last edge here for the emerging technologies, and please understand, we're not looking at this edge as individual infrastructure components. That's going to be found in assets under resources. That's step one. All of these emerging technologies, they were described in the first book. We did not describe them again in the second. So go ahead and look at that information in the first book. We give you the description, its use, and the implications for service management. Again, Randy did a great job in providing this information. But just to give you an illustration of how quickly things change. When we started this first book, we never even thought about including blockchain. But blockchain is now one of the most predominantly discussed technologies, it seems to be today, and what's going to be the next one. So again, the mesh will change as time goes on. Some of these technologies will drop off because they'll be incorporated in something else. New ones will come on. Again, we have that ubiquitous other side that allows us to put it in or to say that that mesh will stay up to date. Again, as we look at the emerging technologies, it is a time relevant listing. The lines that you can put in here are saying, hey, this is, the lines can represent capacity. It could represent the extent of usage across the organization. It could represent maturity. But the bottom line is define that unit of measure that you're using within those lines. So those are the four sides of the mesh individually described. Hopefully that creates some clarity in how we're using this mesh. But then again, let's put them all together and say, what's the big picture that's being presented? Well, I found this graphic, obviously within Adobe Stock, and I thought, oh man, this is great. I wish that I could make it move, and I just don't have that capability, because this is exactly what the mesh does. It will undulate, it will move and flow with the different, the edges as the requirements come in, as the organization changes, how it matures. So the mesh will then become very flexible as it's needed to support the consumer, and support the achievement of the mission, vision, goals, and objectives of the organization. Now, the thing that I want to come back to is that the edges of this mesh, they're defined again by the enterprise governance and the service management principles. They give me the scope, because it makes absolutely no sense to create a product or service that does not fulfill the organizational directives. So let's go ahead and look at the complete mesh now, that we'll see all four sides together. And this is the visual that you could now have to begin that conversation with your consumer or with your design team, something along that line. The major question, I've said it from the very beginning, hopefully it's starting to resonate when we ask, what do the lines represent? Again, the lines represent quantity or quality or maturity or number or proficiency or amount. And I know there's some words in there that were repetitive. The phrase that we used in the book, it's a measure of quantity. It's a number or amount of something. But the rule is, just like with any kind of measure or metric that you create, is that you need to define how to interpret it. So make sure that your units of measures are defined. So predefine what those lines will be, and that will be based on your organizational need and the representation that you need to present. And then we also had some questions about, when these lines, as an organization matures, and I'll just pull up a pointer here. And let's just say, for example, we're looking at this tool line from the service stabilizers and the cloud line, and it says, oh my gosh, what happens when they touch? What does that mean? They run over each other. And I'm just kind of flabbergasted sometimes about that. Make your diagram bigger, change your unit of measure, change your color so you know what it is. Again, it's a visual representation. This is not a hard, specific representation, but it's rather an idea. It generates, it shows me what the possibilities are. And then I can go right on into and saying, well, do we even need to have lines? Does the mesh even need to show lines? We had a great representation last week from 6.6. It was a beautiful early adopter story, and this is their mesh and how that they have portrayed it. And I think it's absolutely brilliant in how they've done this. They haven't really put quality or quantity in these, but what they've done is they've listed some of the elements. So within budget, they're saying what's their financial principles, or the cash flow, the operating budget, what's the overall master philosophy for the budget. Perhaps I'm making something up there, but you understand. Under idle, they're looking at the 5 phases of the service life cycle. For maturity, they're looking at the maturity levels and how they can be applied to something. So, it doesn't even need to show lines, but this is a great idea on how to use the mesh, and this is working very well for 6.6. So those are the basics, and so what I'm going to do now is open up the floor for some questions. If there's questions at this point, I'm happy to answer them. We do have a time limit here, so Simone, do you have any questions?
Yep. Yes, we've got a few. So the first one is from Andrew. Considering interfacing with CRM, if we're looking across the business, how does it work? And he doesn't really mean internal customers or IT, but really the customer on the street. That's the question.
So how does the mesh interface with CRM?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, that's really specific. So let me think here for a second as I pull this back. So let me go back to our mesh diagram. So if we have a specific tool, CRM, and it is providing information around our consumers, remember that VeriSM does not distinguish internal and external. It's kind of an overhead thing. But so we would be thinking of the users of the service. That would be in part of the overall model. So who are the consumers? What are the requirements that are coming in? And then I think the CRM tool becomes one of the tools that you might be using either as a service stabilizer. It may be listed as an asset. I'm not quite sure I understand the overall question. Some of the information might be found within competition. Unless if you can expand on the question a little bit, I'm not sure I can provide more.
I see some additional information, but I just have to read fast because perhaps the CRM question, or sorry, the CRM question is more referring to the interaction with sales and marketing. Does that help?
It would be one of the capabilities that we would have then as an organizational capability as we're collecting. It could be what are the processes behind the addition of customers or the use of the CRM. So it could be part of a managing practice on how we use the CRM. So there's a lot of places that you could put it. That's just very, very specific without some sort of context.
Okay. I've got another question from Rodrigo. He's stating, can we say that the mesh works as a SWOT matrix type, which shows the strong and weak points in an organization?
Sure. Why not? Again, remember the mesh lines are looking at quantity, quality, capability, however you design them. But the biggest thing with this is that you have, in my opinion, with this mesh is that you get this graphical representation at the end that does generate a conversation. I just love the phrase from Claire when she came up with this. It stimulates that conversation. Can some of the information on the mesh come from a SWOT? You bet. That was something that we discussed when we were looking at the environment edge. Okay,
great. Then we've got another question coming in. How will we implement this mesh with tools like we have in ITSM, ITIL? Do we have to integrate with different frameworks like Siam, ISO, DevOps, etc.?
I think we got two questions there. One, I'm going to ask you, or I'm just going to say that you'll see as we go through, because what I'm going to be moving on to now is a couple of examples, and you can see how that mesh has been integrated into two different examples. Secondly, the integration of the mesh, and you can talk about tools. Well, we have another speaker on for today. At the end of the presentation, Simon will be talking about how their organization's tool has adopted and adapted, or not, I should say, adopted some of the VeriSM principles and concepts into their tool. You'll see how that works. And there was something else into that question, and unfortunately, I have forgotten. So if you read it again.
Yes, I will. Sorry. Do we have to integrate with different frameworks like Siam, ISO, DevOps?
Absolutely not. Again, you don't have to do anything. What you want to do is saying, how can I exploit what I have in my organization? And is my organization digitally transforming? What is it that needs to be in place so that I can support the organization, that we move together as an entire entity? Remember that from one of the main principles from VeriSM that we presented in book 1, and it's throughout the entire series, is that the entire organization is a service provider. And we have to take on those principles and thoughts as the entire organization works together. So when you talk about, marketing or sales or whatever it is, well, how does marketing and sales interact? And in fact, one of the examples that I've got coming up, marketing and sales is discussed. So maybe that will give more context to the answer. So do you have to say, well, I'm, this kind of an organization, and we're saying now you have to be X kind of an organization? We're certainly not saying that. Everything that you make, the decisions that you make in VeriSM are going to be based on the consumer needs, whatever they are, and also the guidance and direction provided by your governing body within your organization. So what is documented in your enterprise governance, and how has that been trickled down into your service management principles across the organization? So more on those 2 points will be happening on the 18th and 19th with Johann.
Okay, great. So we've passed the 5 minutes, I think. There are more questions coming in, but we'll take them later, I think.
Okay, fair enough. So
okay.
Thank you so much, Simone. And thank you all for questions. Keep them coming. We'll answer them as we can. So we want to go in here. We have the basics of this mesh, and I'm sure some of you are kind of jumping and saying, hurry up and let's get in here and see how this actually works. So let's go ahead and unwrap, so to speak, the mesh and put it into this first example. So using the cover from the book, those of you who haven't seen the cover or the main graphic that is producing the covers of the VeriSM books, here it is. What I want to do in this unwrap section is to show you the model, a different view of the model and where the mesh interacts. And it will start to give you some insight into I'm not going to say practical side, but the activity side of the unwrapped and applied books. So let's go ahead and look at the model then. This is a different way of viewing the model. We're starting out and saying what we have right now, and that is being shown to you as an underlying organizational portfolio. And in us understanding what we have, we ask a question of saying what's available. We can create a mesh from that. And that's just basically telling us where we are, right? And in any organization, you have an understanding of what's available. Somebody comes up with an idea, that idea is assessed and it's approved perhaps or rejected. If it's approved, then it goes through whatever your organizational process is for turning that idea into that physical product or service. And that's all this line is telling us here. But you can see these 4 arrows that are coming out, and you're absolutely right. These are going to be the areas of the management mesh. So there are really 4 views of a mesh as we go through from an idea to the delivery of a product and service. So there's going to be 4 different views of that mesh. So first off, we're going to start off with a current view. And that's going to be based on the portfolio or what you know of your organization that we will build that mesh out. So it's the current view or the organizational view. That view will then allow us to support the assessment of an idea, okay? An idea comes in for a new product or service. It needs to be reviewed. It needs to go through, whatever process is in place in the organization, be it change management, be a steering committee, being leadership has dictated something happens. But that's when we will go through and start actually defining some of the requirements and how we're going to go out and build that new product or service. So within the define phase, we actually are going to get 2 different views of a mesh. The first one that we'll get is going to be under requirements. What is that that approved new idea or improved product or service going to require? And then eventually we'll also then provide a gap. And if you notice, and I know that you can't read this and you're not supposed to be able to read it, but you should be able to see the different colors. In this first view, we have the green, this is what we have. In the second view, these are the red ones, this is what we need. So these are the requirements. When we overlay the two, so red and green make brown, we kind of get an idea of what's necessary or what we need to reassess and saying, do we have enough of those resources? So that's my gap view. Once we have, we have that gap, we can start figuring out how I'm going to source to fulfill the gap. How I'm going to go about and do the actual design. And from the first book, you remember we have this concept of a service blueprint that allows us to go into the produce and the provide activities. That final view would be in the provide stage when it's an updated view, or it could be coming someplace else. We put it in provide. We made a little internal, I'm just going to say, policy that we would not update our mesh until we've delivered the service. Your organization can have something completely and totally different, but as long as you're consistent. I've done a lot of teaching within ITIL. It's a great framework, and we always end up having the discussions about that service catalog when we start teaching in the service design class and whatnot, as to when do we change or update the information in the service catalog, because by definition it says ready to deploy or be deployed. And yet some organizations, as soon as the idea comes in, they're putting in a new entry into the service catalog and it says under development. Fair enough, you're telling people what's coming. And others will wait until it's actually available. Again, that's organizational policy. What we've done here is just made it kind of simple because it fit better in the diagram. We were going to wait until it was provided, and then we would update that mesh. So, in reality, as we look at this, and if you remember from the first book, the produce and provide activities, these two are really based on what is already in place in your organization. That was one of the main tenets when we were discussing VeriSM and how we wanted to present it, and what you said you wanted in a new service or a new view of service management, is that you didn't want to lose the investment that you've already created, or the investment that you have in your current management practices. And we don't want you to do that either. So most of the activity that as we start and talk about with the mesh is going to happen in the defined stage. And so what I want to do here then is to blow out what is actually in the defined stage and give you a new model. So on the left here, we have the original model that we just saw, but I've kind of, whited out everything and said, well, within define, there's actually quite a few activities that are here. And these are the main chapters within the book around the define activities and the building of the mesh. So once the idea is voiced, so we have this idea, and the idea comes into your into your approval process or assessment and approval process, whatever that might be. We're looking at ways to assess and approve. We present an options-based tool, which those of you may be familiar with. Another tool that we've presented and given you information around is the opportunity portfolio, which is quite compelling. I like that quite a bit. And then the other one is the run, grow, and transform the business model, is understanding what this new product or service will do to the organization. Is it there just to run the business, maintaining status quo? Is it there to grow the business? Is it there to transform? So go back to what Johann had spoken about, is operational side, digital optimization or operationalization, and then going into that digital transformation. Once that idea is approved, we have another chapter around requirements, how they're gathered, how they're analyzed, how they're approved or agreed. Multiple models are presented here because we want to follow a consumer-oriented assessment. So we might use the business model canvas, great tool. We might use another model called the diffusion of innovation. All of these are described in the book, or even Maslow's hierarchy of needs can come into play. The techniques of actually gathering the requirements, we do spend some time here, but I think the main point as we talk about requirements and requirement gathering is around the emphasis on the what. It's not the how, it's what does the business need, what is the business issue, what's the scope, how is after. So we talk about brainstorming and document analysis and user stories and workshops. All of those are described, and we come up with a list of functional and non-functional requirements. We focus then mostly on the traditional and iterative approaches, mainly on the iterative approaches, because the communities now are demanding more, faster, et cetera. So we need to have velocity yet stability. So we spend a lot of time talking about user stories. Once we have those user stories that have been, have the appropriate conversation and confirmation, we then can create the mesh requirements. So we have the required elements, and then we can go into gap analysis, which is the following chapter. We talk about how do we analyze gaps. We give you 3 other models to use, especially looking at that environment side as well as the overall environment and enterprise. Then finally, we talk about sourcing. Again, another chapter on what's the options of sourcing, talk about strategic sourcing, and then also using Siam as a, to support the sourcing efforts. So let's go ahead and apply this really quick. I know that my time is getting quite short here and I need to get through a couple of examples. So here is a generic example. The organizational portfolio for this specific made up organization. You can go through and you can see that they have a fairly robust set of resources. They have some measurement within culture, nothing in competition. They are regulated in some form. They have to form or follow some legal or regulatory information. Their tools, measurements, and processes seem to be fairly generic. There's some sort of an idle shop maybe, or a COBIT shop. They use Siam, and they use 2 emerging practices, BYO and then also cloud. So this is where we start, and again, it's a point in time and analysis, and it allows me to support the assessment of I have an idea. So what we have then is an organization that wants to build a new widget. Okay, this widget has been approved, and then following all the organizational improvement protocols. And so what we've done now in the defined stage is gone out and gathered requirements for this new widget. And if we start up here in resources, we notice that we have quite a bit of knowledge that we need to have. We have some assets that are required. There's a budget associated with it. Some of its suppliers may be different or new. And then also some definite or specific people skills, specialized knowledge and people skills. Going down the environment side, there's some new legislative or regulatory requirements. We have some different measures, and we might have to impact the processes in terms of capacity of a process, something along that line. We also have in this widget, we have a need for, let's just pick one and say security controls. We also need to develop this quickly, so we're going to add agile skills. And we also, since we're adding suppliers, maybe we need to add capacity to Siam. And then you see on the side here, containers, big data, serverless computing, automation, and virtualization have all come up as emerging technologies that can support this new widget, right? So what do we do with this? Well, overlay it with the current view, and you can see very clearly where we have clear gaps, the clear gaps in 27,000, agile, automation, virtualization, the red lines. Where we have overlaps, the overlying areas, we would need to assess those individually and say, are additional resources required, and can the new product and service be supported with the current levels, okay? So to analyze the gaps, we can use some of the techniques that are in the book. There's a simple gap analysis technique, but there's also the McKinsey 7S and the Burke-Litwin and the Nadler-Tushman. And I'm only going to speak about Nadler-Tushman just because timing, and also because it's very, very cool. All 3 of those techniques look organizationally wide, and they include resources and competition and environment and skills, and so things internal and external to the organization. What I like about the Nadler-Tushman model is that it describes how an organization works together, all of the capabilities. It's sometimes known as the congruence model. So strategy provides the priorities and directions to the 4 elements that define the organization: the people, the work that they do, the structure that they're in, and their culture. How these four elements work together will then define the output of this model, which is the organization's performance. The more congruence between people, work structure, and culture, the better the performance. Once we have these gaps and we understand them, we can start working on sourcing. And so that sourcing will be based on the design and the organizational policy and how it will address the gaps. So what we want to do is that we capture this information in the service blueprint, and we then pass it over to the produce and the provide activities for their work. Remember that we are just going to be looking at produce as saying build, test, implement, and validate. We're guided by the guardrails and the stabilizers, those service stabilizers, the guardrails that have come in from the service management policies, or principles rather, and then the provide section, which is really focusing on protecting, measuring, and maintaining that service. So once we're in that provide side, we could be looking at, you know, are we looking for improvements? So looking for waste or trying to make our processes a little bit more lean. We're really trying to focus on how do we achieve the velocity but yet maintain stability. So what we're doing now is following the chosen management practices. VeriSM has not defined anything new in telling you how to build, test, or deploy. We're saying work with service management from an enterprise view. What eventually will happen once we've provided, we will get that updated mesh. Here it is, where we've been able to include the new elements within that new product or service, that widget, right? And we're showing you know, what the mesh looks like now currently. So we could use this mesh for the next idea. So that next new idea that comes in, this could then become the current mesh that we're assessing against. So that's a very quick view of an example. And I'm going to give you a second here. So I'm going to keep it short. So maybe just 2 questions, Simone. Are there questions that are that have come up now?
Yeah. Yes. Hi, Suzanne. Here's Sigrid now.
Okay,
yes, there are some questions. Yeah. One of the questions that we got is, I understand I can change the items represented in the mesh to represent my organization. Should I keep the line items in the mesh the same for all services so that the different meshes are comparable?
Oh, I love this one because I can use my favorite answer. It depends. So not to be flip, I would want to say that the consistency has to be in the unit of measure. As you use your mesh in delivering new services, you know, things will grow, things will change. The new service may not have anything to do or be totally different than previous services. You might have to have a different view. I would hope that you wouldn't have 50,000 different meshes running around, because then you wouldn't know what you're doing. But as things change, I think you're going to have to update that mesh and keep it current. Don't really have a better answer than that, but it really is going to be that it depends. I'm going to need some context. One more question, Sigrid, if you have it.
Yes.
Sign-off in one.
Yeah.
So
okay.
there was one question we got, Suzanne. It's Suzanne here, about how sign-off-in fits in with VeriSM and can be used with VeriSM, because it's included as part of the new book.
Yeah, so Kenevin, I believe. So Johann, if you, I can't see who's still here, so I'm hoping, can you come off of mute and handle that question, please?
Yep. Actually, what we did in the book is we've created a map for you to give you an idea how Kenevin and different types of problems relates to most probably the type of questions that you'll ask when you think about either digital optimization or customer focused transformation or disruption. And what we've also done is in the book is we've given you an idea of what tools and techniques can you use to solve different types of problems. Because most of the traditional problem solving techniques focuses quite a lot on complicated type of questions, where much of the newer literature that we see around innovation and something like the lean startup or whatever, it really attempts to answer questions that's pretty unknown. So it's really complex or even chaotic questions that we try to ask. So we give some guidance. The guidance is not very specific, but hopefully it will help you to think about ways that you can try and answer different interesting questions.
Okay, thank you. For the lack of time, I need to move forward to get into our last example and then also leave time for Simon. I've promised him a pretty big chunk of time, and I think I can do this. So save the questions and maybe we'll have time at the end, or we can answer them offline. So I want to move on into the last example, which has already generated quite a bit of interest from our first webinar. People were asking about our case study in FireCloud Health. And we developed this case study, and it runs throughout Unwrapped and Applied, and have applied the principles that we're discussing in the various chapters to the case study as we kind of step our way through. And you're going to see that stepping through the progression of one organization and a journey within VeriSM. So without any further ado, let's just go ahead and look around the details of FireCloud Health. FireCloud Health is based on two very real, very large United States Midwestern healthcare systems. So we've used their information. They're presenting the problems that they have. We've presented them in the case study. Of course, they're sanitized and whatnot. But what we have within FireCloud Health is 2 level 1 trauma centers, air ambulance service, 15 rural clinical access hospitals, 350 walk-in clinics, 1,500 physicians, 20,000 employees. It's huge. Okay, so it's a large organization. They also have several issues and several named strategic-wide initiatives around federal requirements, growth, proactive health programming, things along that line. The org chart for this organization is shown to you on the screen, and I'm just going to point out something very quickly. You'll notice that IT is underneath finance, but we also have duplicative departments, because this system not only provides physical health care, it also provides health insurance. So the second arm of the business is around the administration and operations of insurance, of an insurance group. The case study details the efficacy of the insurance company as well as the FireCloud Health, but we'll give you the details here. Mission and vision. Mission of FireCloud Health: improve health of the communities that they serve, and the vision to be a national leader for health by 2025. That's key within this case study. Several strategic enablers are listed: people, critical thinking, innovation, agility, information technology, and finance. And this is an organization that wants to start its digital transformation, true digital transformation journey. So you think about those strategic enablers that they feel that they have: innovation, agility, information technology. They're using that as a strategic enabler. The people that they have, critical thinking, all very much important. They also have a set of core values of excellence, integrity, compassion, teamwork, and respect. Those values would be reflected in the service management principles. So what's happened here at this organization is that there's been an annual corporate retreat to talk about changes or advances within this healthcare provider and how to maintain and reach its strategic objectives. So this strategic retreat, they defined several areas of growth. They performed an exercise using Porter's 5 competitive forces to determine the strengths and weaknesses of FireCloud Health. You can read more about Porter's 5 forces within the book. Not going to really hit it right this very second. The outcome that they had was the following initiative. They decided to create a wearable wellness program to support the community health, so for proactive community health. And this program would have an immediate impact across the multiple FireCloud Health capabilities and its consumers. This wearable would drive a healthier community, which in turn would reduce the need for running to any of these health providers and the insurance premiums, etc. The wearable would collect various vital signs of the user. and that would be transmitted and available to the wellness center staff. They would use the emerging technologies of AI and big data, because each individual is automatically monitored. There's a safety feature in the wearable that would hopefully prevent injury during exercise, which is a big differentiator from their competition if you think about the Apple Watch or the Fitbit or something along that line. There's an online feedback portion for this, so that the participants, the wellness programming staff, physicians, the monitoring staff could all get information as needed, and it also would suggest when doctor's appointments would be necessary. So this is kind of a cool little wearable program. But the conditions here that we had is that device, it would allow to collect that data and also to provide that information. Here was the thing: out of this retreat, they wanted a pilot within the next 6 months. Wow, we need to move quickly. So this initiative is approved. They are adopting VeriSM as an enterprise model for service management. So what we need to do first is to build the mesh. Now, this case study is written, and all of the steps are written very clearly in the book, so I'm only going to give you the highlights. What we have here is our initial mesh, and it's from the analysis of the case study. So anytime that you use a case study, we know that there's documented facts. There's also additional clues that we could find, and then also some inferences. Wherever we've made an inference in the book, we've documented it. So this initial mesh, as we look at it, we see that we have great knowledge, we have a little bit of time, we have lots of assets. If I went into some of the issues with this organization, they have multiple data centers that they're now consolidating. They have a huge number of assets. Their budget is quite good. The budget is truly looked at into the strategic initiatives that we have. Finance as a strategic enabler. We also have, a fair number of suppliers. You see that line to be very, very long, and the people that they have is quite large. Culture, very, very good. You looked at the values of the organization. This is I'm going to use a word here, a happy organization. People are really into what they do. It's a good place to work. They are heavily regulated in the United States. Healthcare is at a premium here in terms of regulations and privacy. They have a plethora of tools. Their measurements are not so great. In fact, in the case study, it will tell you that there's multiple complaints around reporting. And the processes that they have several. They name them very quickly, but we have no idea about their maturity, whether or not they're being used across the organization, et cetera. And there is no mention of any kind of emerging technology, but the implication is that they're going into multiple data center consolidations, which would imply to just about anybody that they're going to be using newer technology, and that innovation and IT are also strategic enablers. So we should be able to exploit those emerging technologies. Since this is a project that is approved, first thing that we need to do then is to get the requirements. They developed a wearable team, and it was a representative group for the pilot, which means they had participants in this team. They were the 35 to 45-year-old people from the health insurance program. They already had policyholders from the health insurance aspect. There was some volunteers from the wellness program, 2 physicians, and 4 wellness program staff like nurses, physical therapists, fitness trainers, and then also a member of the insurance group. Time frame is very short, so we know that we're going to be following agile kind of a methodology, that quick iteration. And so what they did is they went out and collected user stories following the as a who, I want what, something, and so that I can do something else. And some of those user stories that they collected, I'm going to flash them up on the screen. They were fun little applications from the participants, from the insurance group, from the physicians itself. A physician wants a consolidated report from each patient so you can review the performance and participation at their semi-annual physicals. The insurance program manager, concise reports so that we can give the appropriate discounts, right? So those user stories were then clarified through the conversations with that wearable team, which includes the designers and developers, as well as all of the participants, and eventually confirmed that that initial wearable was only going to be It's going to make sure that it's water and sweat proof. It was individually programmable, that the initial reporting for this pilot was going to be bi-weekly, and that definitely had an emergency signal into it that would tell the participant when they exceed their maximum performance levels for a certain period of time, which was a differentiator from, you know, the commercially available. So from that understanding, here's the requirements that they came up with. Because of legislation and because it is personal data, they realized they needed to go out and look at ISO 27001, so put in some security controls. They needed to understand their competition and how they're going to differentiate from their competition, and then also multiple emerging technologies were also needed. They decided to use Siam because of the huge number of suppliers that they had, but they were going to use it as a hook to, you know, to start getting all of the suppliers kind of under a centralized control with a supplier integrator. The gap then that we have, well, quite simple. So yellow and red make orange, and you can see the clear lack of elements here, especially on the emerging technology side. But as we look across within the resources, all we would need to do there is saying, does our current level of resources support the needs of this new program? Do I need new skills? Do I need new knowledge? They look at the environment. Competition is huge, so that they're going to need to do something from the, you know, how to manage the competition. The legislation, when they looked into it, they realized that they were already fulfilling most of those requirements, so that did not cause any changes. There were changes in the measurements, and then also in the management practices, as well as, of course, the emerging technologies. Okay, so the second piece of that is that once we know those gaps, we have to go ahead and look at the sourcing and how we're going to deal with it. Well, sourcing is going to be based on the policy. That policy for Fire Cloud Health is listed for you very quickly. They've created a policy that supports their service management principles. And then what they ended up doing was sending out bids, you know, requests for proposals for the physical device, for, you know, web and mobile engineering folks, firmware engineers, et cetera. You can see the list. They also sent out a bid to organizations that could own the entire service, and they would make the decision of whether or not they wanted to support it in-house or they were going to outsource that entire service. The decisions then were created and updated within that service blueprint. The service blueprint then allowed them to start producing and providing that service through their practices that they already had, as well as the additions, you know, around Agile and Siam. So they would go through those practices during that stage. During the provision stage, they needed to look at the ongoing audits and some of the other factors that were going on in Fire Cloud Health. They had some real accreditation issues that were coming up. So what does it look like now? Here is the final mesh of after it's been updated, and anybody that's going to get excited at looking at legislation and big data touching, again, change your scope of the service, move the data around, something along that line, but just to show that it is just a natural representation of what's there. What would this look like in the future, 6 months from now? Well, who knows? You know, many things can happen. People can move on and off. Budgets could change. Technologies can change. Initiatives can fade. New services can come out. So this, you know, it kind of goes back in answering the question from earlier, that this mesh will update and change as the organization changes. One other thing that you can do with the mesh, which is kind of a clever idea, is use it for an investment strategy. Are we over or under invested in some of these areas? And perhaps we can make some changes going through some lean practices, looking for waste and whatnot. So very quickly, I went through that. There's a lot more detail in how these decisions were made and what this organization went through, but I definitely want to give some time here to Simon. So I'm just going to end here very quickly with, you know, an idea that hopefully the questions that you're having are creating ideas on how to do the mesh. There is no one right way to build it. It's going to be specific to your organization, as we've already seen in some of the early adopters. So we're going to save questions for now, and I'm going to pass the floor over to Simon as we look at how some organizations are supporting the mesh. Before I give it to you, Simon, just want to make people aware that ServiceNow and For.me will be talking in the next sessions on the 18th and 19th. But right now, Simon Kent from Solaritus. Simon, it's yours.
Suzanne, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me okay.
Perfect.
Great, thanks for that. And just before I talk through these screens here, I just want to say thank you to the IFDC and yourself and Johann and everybody that's contributed. It was a real honor to be asked to be participating into this webinar and have the chance to design the management mesh inside of a tool set, inside of a technology. That was real fun. I did enjoy that, and that's what we're going to be looking at today in this next 10 minutes, probably less than that, but we'll keep it on point and keep it on track. So let me just talk firstly through this particular area. So this refers back to organizational portfolio and that kind of what is our current as is state. And that comes from our business capabilities. So inside of the tool set here, this tool set is called Convergence, by the way, and we've built this on top of the Cherwell Service Management platform, Enterprise Service Management platform. So it plays in the same space as ServiceNow and For.me and other tool sets that play in that space. And Solaritus are a premium partner for Cherwell Service Management in the UK and Europe, and we've applied the management mesh, as you will see, into our Convergence tool set that is, like I say, built on Cherwell. So what we have in Convergence is a piece on the left-hand side, if you could just highlight that with your pointer there, Suzanne, called the value framework. Now, inside the value framework, this is where you can represent the organizational portfolio. So this matches organizational portfolio as defined in VeriSM. And where we start with this is capabilities and business capabilities. And the way we consider business capabilities is these are the competencies, the resources, the assets, the processes that make up the technologies that make up the organization as a whole. And a business capability, we adapted a business capability record to encompass the management mesh VeriSM category. So that being environment, resources, management practices, and emerging tech. So if you wouldn't mind moving on there, Suzanne, onto the next slide. Okay, so let's take this one step further. So we're still at the organizational portfolio stage here. But what we're looking at now is saying, okay, so if we have these capabilities, we know what we're doing as an organization in terms of our capabilities, like I say, these environment, the resources, our competencies, our assets, and so forth. How do those capabilities match to our target outcomes and our current outcomes as an organization? So our outcomes underpin our top level objectives, and we capture all of this inside of Convergence. So we really know in Convergence where we're heading. Okay, so we know what our top level strategy is. We know that what the outcomes and the measurable outcomes, but the beauty of where VeriSM and the management mesh play is to be able to now associate capabilities to outcomes on a outcome by outcome basis. So what we've done is said, it's okay to have multiple management meshes. Okay, that's our interpretation. I'm not saying this is dictated. I'm just saying that's our interpretation, to say for each outcome that underpins a strategic objective, we associate or we blend our capabilities to meet that outcome. So I like to kind of think in metaphors. So that's just the way my brain works. And I was thinking the other day when thinking about this, and capabilities I think of as almost like ingredients. And these are the ingredients of our of our business, okay? And these are represented as capabilities. An outcome and the way those capabilities are blended becomes like a recipe. So it's like saying, hey, I've got all these capabilities and these ingredients in the cupboards of my kitchen, right? In the cupboards of my business kitchen, but I want to make a certain recipe. So I take certain ingredients and I blend them together in a recipe to produce an outcome. Okay, and that's what we do inside of the tool set here. So we're still at that organizational portfolio level, but it is, how do we blend capabilities to deliver an outcome? And the way we do that is by introducing the management mesh strands. So in the diagrams that we've seen throughout this presentation, we've been seeing these mesh strands in the representation of the management mesh. What we have done is said, okay, well, a mesh strand actually is a record type that is against an outcome, and that mesh strand represents a capability at a certain level. As Suzanne was saying, you have to make sure that you have your measurement governance in place to determine, well, what does a level 8 mean, or what does a level 80 mean, or what does a good, bad, whatever mean. You have to have that in place, but we allowed that in the tool set to say, here is a measurement of that mesh strand capability, and that measurement means this. So we define that in a governance lookup table. So with that allows us to produce, as you can see on the screen here, a representation of the management mesh. Now, what we've done is also said that's a representation of both the as-is state, and it also represents, if we've gone through transformation, it will also represent the new state as well. Now, that's a bit of artistic license on our part that we said, well, that makes sense to us that we would do that. So, Suzanne, if you wouldn't mind moving on. So now we get to the idea. Now, the great idea that we capture this in our value management section of Convergence, and we capture this as a business initiative. Now, the business initiative at the value plan stage allows us to link the idea, the business initiative, to the existing outcome. Now, with that in play, that allows us to pull in all of those mesh strands that we defined, all of those ingredients that we defined for that recipe. We could pull that straight in for our business initiative or our idea, which gives us a baseline. But from that, we can then say, okay, for this idea, for this transformation, for this change, we need to make these adjustments. We need to have these capabilities. We need to have these, and these are all pulled in again with mesh strands. So we have this object called mesh strands that allows us to make this representation, and from which we can do, these are the requirements. And that's what you're seeing there. So this is the requirements management mesh for a given idea or a given business initiative. And then moving on, finally, to the last slide, we have the ability to say, well, if we pulled in the current as-is state for a given outcome, and that outcome is linked to the initiative, but then we know what our new requirements are, we can now do the gap analysis, and that's what we do on this particular screen as we click another button and say, show me the gap analysis and the representation of that other management mesh for the gap analysis. So it's a very quick synopsis there, but I hope that helps show that the management mesh and VeriSM is well and truly alive inside of technology, inside of platforms. And this is, like I say, built on a regular service management platform technology that is available across the world today. So thanks, Suzanne. I think we're leading on to more questions.
Yeah, Simon, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. And I know that it wasn't near enough time, but I appreciate you being succinct, because I certainly wasn't. So any specific questions, Sigrid, around the tool that Simon could answer quickly?
No, at this moment, no specific questions. No.
Okay, and I'm just going to go ahead and move on. Then Simon, again, thank you so much, and let everybody know what's coming up next. There's 2 webinars coming up on the 18th and the 19th. You can see the dates and the times. Starting at the beginning, the importance of governance within VeriSM, and finishing with technology, as we know that ServiceNow and For Me will also be presenting a little bit. There'll be an author Q&A, so if you still have questions, please join us on one of those times. We will be live and answering questions, and there also will be a special announcement at that point that the IFDC will be putting forward. If you need to sign up for these, and of course you do, the quick link is going to verism.global and then going to the event tab, and you'll see the various events. If you can write this all down very quickly with the GoToWebinar, good for you. That would be very impressive. And then lastly, for the last piece of announcement, the book Unwrapped and Applied will be formally launched at ITSMF USA Fusion event in St. Louis on September 30th to October the 3rd.
Yeah. And Suzanne, yeah. I'm sorry, but there was one question for Simon, if he's still there.
Sure.
Yeah, is Simon still there?
Yeah, sure. I was just coming off mute.
Okay,
yeah.
So let's try. There was one question for you. How about following the development through the eyes of economy? I bet that would interest management. I'm sorry. Yeah. Was that clear for you?
I'm not sure I really understand the question or the point.
I think, yeah, I think my interpretation of it, Simon, is the idea of a sort of management mesh seen maybe through the eyes of C-level, so focused more on the economical side of things. That's, I think, how I interpret the question. I agree it's a bit difficult without context.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the management mesh in convergence is the representation of, you know, the capabilities that are required for where we want to get to, but it also allows us to say, you know, what are we changing, so therefore we can get that gap. Just a quick note, a point on convergence is that is part of business initiative, and business initiative includes, in the process stages of a business initiative, includes the economic viability of a given initiative as well. So that's part of convergence.
Okay, so just as a tie-on here for Simon, in Unwrapped and Applied, Solaritas has provided a full case study around this functionality, so you'll be able to see more in that documentation as well. So I forgot to say that at the beginning, and I apologize.
Thanks, Suzanne.
Oh, you bet, and we appreciate your support here. So anything else, Sigrid, from your end?
No, that's it. And thank you all very, very much. Suzanne, Johann, Simon, thank you all.
Yeah, I highlight those as well. And thank you so much, Johann and Simon, for your participation. And looking forward to seeing everybody on the 18th of September. Cheers for now.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Freaking get out of here. I can't leave the meeting. Well, let's just do that. Quit. Yeah.